Regicide. It means the killing of a monarch, and in the United Kingdom, it's something we typically associate with the medieval and early modern periods, when king after king met a sticky end as the rich and powerful fought for supremacy. But what if I told you that the most recent example of regicide occurred not in the distant past, but less than a century ago, in a plush bedroom at Sandringham House? This is History Calling, where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the past, and today we're discussing the murder of George V, how it was covered up for half a century, and the incredibly dangerous views which his killer expressed in the House of Lords less than a year later, and which hinted at what he'd done. It's the 17th of January 1936. The location is Sandringham House in Norfolk, England, country home of the King of the United Kingdom, George V. George is 70 years old and he is gravely ill. A long-time smoker, he began to complain of a cold on the 15th and took to his bed. This is no ordinary cold though. George is in his final decline. The king has come close to death before. In November 1928, he contracted a serious chest infection that nearly killed him, and was only saved by the efforts of his trusted doctor, Bertrand Dawson, Baron Dawson of Penn. He was also made a Viscount after the king's death. Dawson drained off a large quantity of fluid from an abscess in December, and this, along with additional treatment, including the removal of 2 ribs, ultimately enabled the nearly dead king to make an unexpected recovery. There is to be no such reprieve 7 years later. Dawson is present again now, as the king deteriorates before his and everyone else's eyes. George's last diary entry is from the 17th and reads, "Dawson arrived this evening. I saw him and feel rotten." Also present were 2 other doctors and Sister Catherine Black, the king's longtime nurse who has been with him since the 1928 illness. Bulletins are released to the public, gradually preparing them for the inevitable. After at first saying only that he had a cold, on Saturday the 18th of January, the newspapers all carry this notice, which was actually released on the Friday night. The bronchial catarrh from which His Majesty the King is suffering is not severe, but there have appeared signs of cardiac weakness which must be regarded with some disquiet. Later on Saturday, another bulletin. The anxiety expressed in the bulletin of last night persists. Then, at 3:30 p.m, His Majesty the King has had some hours of restful sleep. Cardiac weakness and the embarrassment of the circulation have slightly increased and give cause for concern. On Sunday the 19th at 11 a.m, in spite of a restless night, His Majesty the King has maintained strength. There is no change reported for the rest of the day, and on Monday morning it is announced that the King has had a more restful night. There is no substantial change to record in His Majesty's condition. That changes later in the day, for at 5:30 p.m. comes the news that the condition of His Majesty the King shows diminishing strength. Then at 9:25 p.m, the famous announcement that the King's life is moving peacefully to its close. At 12:10 a.m. on the 21st comes the news that death has come peacefully to the King at 11:55 p.m. George lies in state in Westminster Hall in London. There is a large funeral, and he is buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle on the 28th of January. That seems to be that. Soon attention turns to the antics of his son and heir, the new Edward VIII, and his determination to marry his mistress, Wallis Simpson. This ultimately leads to the abdication crisis and the accession of George VI less than 11 months later. The world moves on. Lord Dawson of Penn dies in 1945. George VI in 1952, and Queen Mary, George V's widow, in 1953. Edward VIII, by then the Duke of Windsor, dies in 1972. Then, in December 1986, 50 years after George V's passing, his death is suddenly headline news again, when extracts from Dawson's diaries are published. The entry concerning the death of his most famous patient reveals that while George was indeed seriously ill and probably wouldn't have lived another day, his actual cause of death was anything but natural. It reads, "At about 11 o'clock, it was evident that the last stage might endure for many hours, unknown to the patient, but little comporting with that dignity and serenity which he so richly merited, and which demanded a brief final scene. Hours of waiting just for the mechanical end, when all that is really life has departed, only exhausts the onlookers and keeps them so strained that they cannot avail themselves of the solace of thought, communion, or prayer. I therefore decided to determine the end, and injected myself morphiagrams 3/4, and shortly afterwards cocaine gram 1, into the distended jugular vein. Myself, because it was obvious that Sister B was disturbed by this procedure. In about a quarter of an hour, breathing quieter, appearance more placid, physical struggle gone." Now let's dissect this remarkable admission. The diary shows that Dawson didn't bother asking the other doctors present what they thought should be done, and notes that although Queen Mary and the Prince of Wales said that they didn't want the king's life artificially extended, they did not give consent for what his doctor did, nor would it have mattered if they had. It still would have been illegal. He even admitted that he acted as he did because he wanted the king's death announced in the morning edition of the Times newspaper on the 21st, and not in the, quote, less appropriate evening journals. This snobbish desire created a literal deadline, and when George wouldn't die sufficiently fast, the doctor took matters into his own hands to make sure things worked out the way he wanted. Catherine Black, despite her scruples, never reported him, and made no mention of the regicide when she published her autobiography in 1939, though at that stage there still would have been time to hold Dawson to account. His biographer, Francis Watson, left it out of his book published in 1950 at the request of the Dowager Lady Penn, but in fairness to him, it was he who finally revealed the truth in 1986, ending the half-century-long cover-up. By that point, it was of course too late to do anything, and so unsurprisingly, Buckingham Palace's comment was simply that it happened a long time ago and all those concerned are now dead. They were right, it was a long time ago, and even more so now. So does it still matter that this happened? In fact, did it ever matter? After all, the most unsentimental amongst you might just shrug and say that George had only hours to go when Dawson finished him off, and is it really regicide under these circumstances? It's not like he was executed like Charles I or killed in battle like Richard III, after all. So let's dive into the ethics of this a little deeper and determine if regicide is the correct word. In my opinion, what happened to George does matter very much and always did. First and foremost, because it's wrong. Just because a person is ill, even at death's door, doesn't mean someone else has the right to push them through it. The laws of the land apply to everyone. You're not special because you're a doctor, and you're certainly not allowed to kill people when you decide their lives have become worthless. You'll note that civilized societies don't make a habit of killing people in vegetative states, for instance, and if life support is withdrawn, it's a decision made by a group of people, usually including doctors and family members, and can result in a long legal process unless the person in question left very clear instructions in a document like a living will. It is not left up to an attending physician to make a unilateral decision. There's also a big difference between withdrawing life support from a critically ill or injured patient with little to no brain function and deliberately poisoning them. I know I'm simplifying a very big, very complex issue here, but I hope you take my point, which is that there is no getting around the fact that what Dawson did was murder by 1936 standards, and by those of the modern era. As the murder of a king, that also made it regicide. There may be those who argue that such actions should be allowed. However, I think you'd find few of them who would claim that this practice should be carried out without the patient's knowledge or consent and/or at the whim of a single person. Finally, George was in and out of consciousness. Had he had the chance, perhaps he would have awoken again to speak to his family, but his doctor's actions ensured that he never got the opportunity. Now let's look at Dawson's reasoning. On the one hand, he tries to paint his actions as a mercy killing, saying he did it to spare the family further suffering and give the king a more dignified end. And I've no doubt that there was an element of compassion in his decision. Had he thought the king had any chance of survival, I don't think he would have done this, and I don't wish to paint him as a psychopath. However, I don't think his compassion was as much of a motivating factor as he claimed. By his own admission in his notes, George was unconscious, and the royal family gathered at the bedside were actually very calm and composed, all things considered. Quote, "The Queen dignified and controlled, others with tears, gentle but not noisy." The exception was the soon-to-be Edward VIII, who greatly disliked his father, but seems to have been having a bit of a meltdown at the prospect of his impending accession, and was in floods of tears, constantly embracing his famously standoffish mother and leaving the room. Still, it was not especially undignified or horrific, though. It sounds like the king was very quietly and painlessly moving out of this world at his own pace. His pace just wasn't fast enough for Dawson's convenience. He'd made the announcement that the monarch would soon be dead, and would look stupid if George continued to linger much longer. So I would argue that it wasn't his patient's needs at the forefront of his mind, but his own. There was also the acknowledged but insane reason of wanting the death announced in the morning edition of the Times. What kind of a bizarre little bubble was Dawson in that was a factor in the medical care he was giving to his patient? While J.H.R. Ramsay, writing in the British Medical Journal in 1994, and not to be confused with the Francis Ramsay mentioned earlier, said that the doctor was also motivated by a desire to get back to his busy London practice, rather than hanging around in Norfolk. If George had been at Buckingham Palace, and had seemed likely to be dead by dinner time, I wonder if Dawson would have thought then that his comatose patient's suffering, or that of his family, was so great that the king needed to be tipped over the edge a few hours early. When summing up the doctor's motivation, I thought Ramsay put it well when he said of Dawson that he was guilty of the besetting sin of doctors, and that is of arrogance. He arrogantly assumed that he, and he alone, had the special insight to appreciate the importance of the timing of the king's death. It was also unfeeling of Dawson to involve Sister Black in his plan, and arrogant to assume that her conscience was as elastic as his own. I think this arrogance, not to mention a dangerous naivety, also comes across in a speech Lord Dawson of Penn gave in the House of Lords just 10 months after the king's death. The topic of euthanasia was being debated, and when you know what Dawson had done just that January, his comments are both telling and chilling. He was against allowing the practice to become legalised and regulated, and that's the key word here, not because he objected to it in principle, he said, but because he believed that the final decision, quote, belongs to the wisdom and conscience of the medical profession and not to the realm of law. Protection from misuse can only derive from the profession itself, end quote. I'm not going to read out the whole speech, though I will leave it linked below for you, but in essence, he didn't want anyone to be able to impinge on doctors' authority in the sick room and check on what they were doing, except perhaps other doctors. He further claimed, without providing any evidence to support his statements, and those of you who have been with me for a while will know just how much I love it when people do that general medical and lay opinion was in favour of such killings, and that, quote, most doctors, where there is pain or struggle, bring peace at the last despite curtailment of life, and with the support and even at the request of lay opinion. Think about what he had said. He was claiming that the British medical profession was so out of control that doctors were routinely killing patients, even though that constituted murder, and then presumably covering it up, as such a thing could never be admitted to, except apparently by him. Furthermore, he was saying that doctors were doing this at the request of family members, which is what he means by lay opinion. What a handy way to get a hold of your inheritance, or be rid of an annoying spouse so that you can marry your bit on the side without the pain of a divorce. Poison someone close to you, tell the doctor they've been very poorly and you hate to see them suffer, then get the doctor to finish them off for you, and perhaps in so doing even destroy the evidence of the original assault. I'm amazed his comments didn't lead to a full-scale inquiry, an insistence that he provide names, and then prosecutions. He was also so naive that he actually thought that this could be self-regulated, and that killing people didn't belong to the realm of law. How many times have we seen, not just in the medical profession, but in others too, that junior workers will defer to older ones, that stronger personalities will override weaker, and that co-workers are either reluctant to report each other or have been disbelieved and even punished for reporting the misdeeds of others. Anyone in a position of power over others, especially over vulnerable people, has to be subject to constant and robust oversight, and Dawson's own case is a prime example of why this is so important. Catherine Black watched him kill the king despite her misgivings about it and without Dawson telling the other doctors present, and she never said a word about it. There was no regulation there. Furthermore, we've seen how he killed to suit his own convenience, even when the patient was unconscious and not suffering. There was no pain or struggle in George's case, though those were the circumstances in which Dawson presented his recommendations to the Lords. If his suggestions had been taken up, just think how many more people would have been killed because their doctors wanted to get home early for their dinner or to watch the cricket. It wouldn't have taken long before patients who would have survived were being bumped off by impatient medical practitioners who couldn't be bothered to wait and see what would happen or administer life-saving but time-consuming care, and that's on top of the potential for murders by family members and beneficiaries, which I mentioned a minute ago. In short, I don't think Dawson was anywhere near as clever as he thought he was, and he certainly had a very simplistic view of human nature and a serious God complex. His comments to the Lords made it clear that he thought anyone capable of getting a medical degree was automatically so brilliant and special that their wisdom and conscience and decisions about whether to take another's life were above reproach, and that the mere suggestion of checking that they weren't abusing their power and that the medical profession wasn't becoming prey to rampant serial killers was a ridiculous insult made by lesser, stupider people who needed to stay in their lane and not question doctors' orders. Yet he himself was a prime example of the dangers of his own suggestions. Because he wanted medical killings to be legal, he just started acting as though they already were. And apparently, if he is to be believed, so did others. It shows, in my view, his utter contempt for the law he was pretending to debate in the House of Lords. His suggestion of turning a blind eye to the unregulated killing of defenceless, non-consenting patients was so dangerous that fortunately smarter heads than his prevailed, and the bill failed. In fact, no such law has ever been passed in the United Kingdom. Still, I have to wonder how many others were victims of his so-called mercy, because he thought he knew better than everyone else and didn't have to abide by the rules. It's a sobering thought. So that's the story of how George V really died, and of the man who killed him. If you've enjoyed this content, please do remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and you can also find me on Patreon, Instagram and Amazon, all of which are linked below for you. You might also want to check out my website, historycallingofficial.com, where you can sign up to my newsletter and marketing emails and get a free download providing 5 quick and easy tips for spotting good and bad history books. It's linked below for you and you can unsubscribe at any time. Let me know in the comments if you would agree that George was a victim of regicide, or if you would class his manner of death in some other way. If royal medical stories are your thing, check out this video next on whether Henry VIII was brain damaged or just really mean. Or you can see my medical playlist. If you prefer to stick with the Windsors, I would suggest this episode on whether Prince Harry and the Duchess of Sussex could lose their titles. I'll be back next week with a new video, and until then, keep learning.